In the novel The Sicilian by Mario Puzo, for those who don't know, that would later become The Godfather 2 and The Godfather 3, minus the main character of The Sicilian. So, in Mario Puzo's novel, The Sicilian, Vito Corleone says to Michael Corleone, "It's easy to admire people who don't compromise." And I agree with that. It really is. I have a great deal of respect for Bernie Sanders. The problem that I have with him is that governance, by definition, is the art of problem solution, where no one likes the solution and it only kind of works. Well, in order for that to happen, there has to be a great deal of compromise. And Senator Sanders, in spite of all of his positives, which he has a great many, he doesn't really compromise. Now, again, I respect that. If you're so sound in your beliefs, then you should stick to those beliefs. But if your objective is to govern, well, don't let good enough, let me rephrase that. Don't let perfect become the enemy of good enough. Because in the end, governing, especially with large populations, so for instance, in the US, there's 345 million people. With a population of 345 million people, I don't care how hard you try, you're going to piss somebody off. Someone is not going to get what they want. Someone is going to get more than what they want. Someone is not going to get enough to survive. It's the nature of the animal. It's the way it works. So the next question then is, well, why did I bring that up? I've been thinking a lot about what happened that we became so polar. And the answer is nothing. We've always been this polar. From the very beginning. From before the United States existed, we've been this way. A large part of that is our education system has failed us. A great example is game theory, specifically zero-sum game theory. Nobody understands how it works. Now, I am not going to claim to understand how it works. I really don't. But the minimax theorem, as explained by Lawrence Kasky in the 5 Golden Rules of Mathematics, really taught me a lot about zero-sum game theory. One of the big things it taught me is that it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as zero-sum. So there will never be a condition where one player wins, one player loses. It's always going to fall on a continuum. A player has to sacrifice some stuff to gain an objective. And another player has to sacrifice other stuff to lose less of their resources. That's how zero-sum game theory works in a nutshell. You want greater detail? I could probably recommend a ton of books you can read. But beyond that, more accurately, there's a guy on YouTube who does math textbooks, and he could recommend a whole bunch of books that you could read. But beyond that, so let's take a look at the specifics of where we are. And in the context of U.S. history, how did we get here? A couple things I want to base this conversation on. Professor Roy Casagrande from the Austin School, or Austin Community College in Austin, Texas, made the comment that there is no left-center government. There never has been, there never will be. Intuitively, that makes sense. I agree with that. The reason for that is we get comfortable with what we know, the way that we're doing things, we get comfortable with it. We really don't want to shift away from that. And it takes a great deal, an inordinate amount of data. In other words, the amount of data that's required to get us to move from a system that we're comfortable with to a new system, that amount of data that's required exceeds the amount of data that proves by orders of magnitude, not just one order of magnitude, which for some of you, you'll understand that means times 10, but for others of you, you can use the definition you're using by a lot. So, by multiple orders of magnitude would be the required data to get us to move off of a system that we like. Going back to the statement from Professor Casagrande, we just got comfortable with this idea of this is the way it's always been and there's no reason to change. That idea of don't fix it if it's broke. But the problem is it's always broken. We're never fixing it. Okay? So we've always been right of center. The governing style for the whole world, everywhere, even if you're a tribal community, that governing style has always been right of center. And the probability is it will never move from right of center. We have to accept that before we can move forward. The second thing that I want us all to understand is that free market and capitalism doesn't exist. Every time an economic bubble pops, and it's been this way from the beginning. In other words, prior to the existence of the United States, prior to the existence of the United Kingdom, from the time prior to the time that we were feudal societies, living with landholding nobles and serf societies that worked the land in return for table scraps. Before that, every time an economic bubble popped, society in general bailed out industry. Again, this is the way it's always been. We could change it. We don't want to. We've never wanted to. And the probability is, regardless of how much we should change it, we won't. Addressing the earlier statement about a free market doesn't exist. Monopolies are efficient. Once you get market power, no company understands, well, I'm the market giant. I can only lose customers. No company understands that. No individual seems to understand that. When you're at the top, there's only one way you can go. Down. Somebody's going to come up with a better idea, a better process, a better something. They're going to be able to get venture capital. They're going to use that venture capital to effectively compete with you. And because their process, whatever it is so far superior, at some point their sales staff is going to outperform yours. And you're going to lose client base. It's the way it works naturally. Once that happens, they're going to do exactly what you did. They're going to buy up everybody that can compete with them and guarantee those ideas don't reach the market, thusly developing a monopoly. Take a look at what Facebook did. Amazon.com does it to every single one of their competitors. Even the people that provide product for Amazon.com. Amazon.com does this too. If those people begin to make more money than Amazon.com is comfortable with, Amazon.com will either try to buy them out or will stop customers from buying their product. That's not a free market. It never was, it never will be. A free market is you make a product that's better. I like your product more than your competitor's product. I'm going to buy your product. I hate Walmart. I cannot tell you the depth of disgust I have for Walmart Corporation. They're currently under 14 compliance degrees for wage theft. Their entire healthcare program is just put it on Medicaid so that the taxpayers pay for our employees' healthcare. They have the second highest population of SNAP recipients. I hate Walmart. I would love to shop at the grocery store down the street from me. The problem is I can't afford their prices. I'm relegated to shop at Walmart because I don't make income. I don't make the money to where I can shop local. So, here it is. That's not the free market. That's my inability to generate income. So, understanding those things. There's no such thing as let me rephrase. All governments are right of center. The free market doesn't exist. We don't live in a capitalist society. All of that out of the way. We need to know all of that before we can begin. Now, beginning. In the 1787-1788, when they sat down to reform the government, because the Confederate States of America failed. The Confederate States of America failed because there was no state that was willing to build coalitions. It's easy to respect people who don't compromise. No one was willing to compromise. Nobody was willing to take one for the team. So in the end, the entire team lost. The Confederate States of America collapsed. It collapsed because there was no mechanism to control things like interstate commerce. There was no mechanism to make foreign trade deals, so that for the stuff that we couldn't produce here, there was no way to bring it in because there was no central government clearinghouse to do all of those things. Initially, our idea was to leave it to the rich people. And so the rich people would make the decisions on how to do these things. Because the thinking was, well, they have the financial resources. It never occurred to anybody to realize they have those financial resources because they're not using them. Right? So you ended up with Cornelius Vanderbilt. You ended up with this large group of people. John Davidson, Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, where they made the rules. They had the gold, they made the rules, that was the end of the story. And since your employment was based on keeping them happy, you just didn't do things like going to unions. And most people didn't realize that there was something different. Most people didn't realize that there were other ways to live. Moving forward, all kinds of problems. Important note to drop here, though it might not make sense, I'm hoping that tying it in later will make it make sense. The Senate filibuster was developed in 1862, 1863, something like that. The Senate filibuster was designed strictly to prevent the passage of the 13th Amendment For those who don't know, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery and makes black people equal. In other words, a black person's vote is one vote. Prior to the 13th Amendment, a black person was 3/5, or 60% of a human being. Now, the 13th Amendment didn't actually change anything. The reason it didn't change anything is because we're colonizers. We have the attitude of colonizers. And since we colonized and we brought the slaves to advance our colony, we didn't feel that the 13th Amendment had to change our attitude about it, right? So there was no impetus on our part, i.e. the electorate, to understand that just saying somebody is equal doesn't make them equal. We have to behave as their equal in order to make them equal. Okay? Since we chose not to do that, things pretty much stayed the same. Moving on. You're applying this attitude that we have towards slaves towards poor people. No, they're poor. That means that they don't have the right to exist. Couple of problems with that. They exist. And specifically for MAGA conservatives, right? This statement is for you. Since they exist, they have the right to exist. It's not a question anymore. It's only a question if they don't exist. Once they exist, they have the right to exist. The debate's over. That being out of the way. So we're giving power over labor to industry. Now, the thing is, let's look at the example of Walmart. 14 plus compliance degrees for wage theft. Non-prosecution agreements, or NPAs, on those wage theft compliance decrees. Which basically means we told Walmart, don't do it again. Guess what? Walmart's going to do it again. And you know what we're going to do? Don't do it again. Why not just fine Walmart $15 billion? Their profit last year was $2 billion. You fine them $15 billion, they're not going to do it again. And I promise you, it won't bankrupt Walmart. They'll just borrow against their stock value. So, let's look at that. Now, we get to the Great Depression. Bubble pops, it can't be fixed because the fraud was rampant. The fraud was completely out of control. The fraud was out of control because we defer to rich people. They're rich and therefore they must be smarter than us. But if you look at it realistically, all those CEOs that get the multi-billion-dollar payouts at the end of their term, they drove their company in the ground. They were driving their companies into bankruptcy. So the company paid them tens of millions of dollars to go away. Do you see where our idea of, well, the rich, they must be smarter than us, fails? So basically, a major corporation decided it was cheaper to pay their CEO tens of millions of dollars to quit than it was to keep them on and allow them to run the company into the ground. You see where our attitude is coming in as the electorate? We don't pay attention to that. We don't realize that tens of millions of dollars in bonuses that the CEO got paid is not because he did a great job. It's because he was really destroying the company, and the company just wanted him to go away. You want to see another good example of this? Boeing is primarily an R&D company. Up until the time that they were purchased by McDonnell Douglas. About 4 months after McDonnell Douglas purchased Boeing, Boeing started having safety problems. They were doing fine. In fact, it was Douglas Curtiss Aircraft, a division of McDonnell Douglas, that had all of the safety problems for United States aircraft manufacturers. There is one exception. The exception is Lockheed, and Lockheed doesn't make commercial aircraft. Lockheed makes military aircraft. Looking at it again, Douglas Curtiss Aircraft had such a bad safety record that for almost a decade, no American airline was allowed to buy their aircraft. A division of McDonnell Douglas. 4 months after the McDonnell Douglas Boeing merger, Boeing is having safety problem on safety problem on safety problem. And as the American electorate, you're going to look at me and say, oh, that's just a coincidence. No, it really isn't. McDonnell Douglas does not make their money by producing product. McDonnell Douglas makes their money by swindling DARPA. Now, I got to hand it to President Clinton. He fined Lockheed Martin a large sum of money. He got about a third of what DARPA paid to Lockheed Martin back. But McDonnell Douglas has never been fined. They should be. And in point of fact, they should lose their DARPA contract. They're not a good company. They don't behave ethically. They don't have any safety standards. They're just making money by ripping off the American taxpayer. And you, the American taxpayer, keep saying, oh yeah, we have to do this. Now, I actually blame the libertarians for that, because as far as the libertarians are concerned, the only thing that you're willing to pay taxes for is defense. And you don't understand why that's problematic. I present to you McDonnell Douglas. And you can do your own research. You'll discover that McDonnell Douglas is bad at everything. They can't do anything right. And yet, you're perfectly fine with giving them your tax dollars. But again, none of this actually addresses the issue on how we became so polar. Right? So come the Great Depression. President Hoover, who came from industry, he was a CEO for some major company somewhere, whatever. So he decides that he's going to handle things the way he would handle them if he was the CEO of a company. The end result of that is, what was it, like 40% of the country was unemployed? And at this time, there is no social safety net. It doesn't exist. And traditionally, the way we used to handle that was we were small. Yeah, by this time, there's roughly 100 million plus people in the country. But we're still small. So, you know your neighbors, and if you're having a rough time, your neighbor is going to make dinner, not just for them. They're going to make you dinner too. And they bring dinner to your house. But then your neighbor also loses their job. Your neighbor can't do that anymore. They don't have the resources either. And then entire communities run into this problem where there are no resources. And FDR has a brilliant idea. It's genius in its simplicity. Why not take some of the money that the government collects in taxes and use it to help people out until they get a job? Here's where we get the split. Here's where it gets really bad. So shortly before this, The Jungle was published. The Jungle followed a poor, viciously poor family through their lives in the meatpacking industry and the importance of politics, and how the political conditions defined the way this family lived. Yurgis, the main character in The Jungle, becomes a Democrat. He becomes a Democrat because the Democratic Party is paying him money. It's also important to understand that at this point the Democrats are still the conservatives. I want to make it clear, the Republicans are still the liberals here. So we're in the 1930s, 1920s. It's after the Great Depression that we have the switch, where the Democrats are the liberals and the Republicans are the conservatives. And the Democrats are the liberals because the Democrats understand something very fundamental. You can't have a consumer-driven economy if consumers can't afford to consume. The Democrats seem to understand that. That understanding turns them into liberals. Because you got to have consumers if you want to have our pseudo-capitalist society. You got to have consumers if you want to have our pseudo-free market. Now we get the switch. But here's the problem. Monsanto, Dow Corning, which are becoming major players. IBM, which did the genius thing of converting from manufacturing to sales. Because at that time, IBM had the largest sales force in the world. So now they're fighting all of these changes. And they're discovering that they just don't have the numbers. Everybody's starving to death, so everyone's on board with FDR's idea. The New Deal sounds really good. The electorate is saying, yes, we want the New Deal. And the only reason the electorate is saying that is they're literally starving to death. As you recall from your historical studies in elementary school, people are selling their kids. This is the world they lived in. But the companies, now they're having to pay taxes. So prior to that, taxes for companies were done by tariff. In another video, perhaps, I'll explain how you can successfully implement a tariff. In that video, I'll make the comment that it'll take approximately 50 years, which is why the Trump tariffs were a bad idea from the beginning. You're not going to get instant returns from a tariff. They're not designed that way. They were never meant to do instant returns. So, another video, maybe. So you get to this place where you have approximately 4,000 rich people arguing with approximately 80 million people that are starving to death. And you see how we're beginning to get polar. I'm going to go back to the filibuster for the 13th Amendment. Towards the end, right before FDR is about to, or more accurately, Truman is about to ratify the end of the New Deal. The Republicans do a filibuster. It didn't work. And it's the last time we see the filibuster until 1962, when LBJ decides to do the Great Society. And the Great Society suffers a handful of filibusters. It survives. Then we get to Nixon. Creep, which was basically G. Gordon Liddy and John Dean, they make a mess of Watergate. Nixon had his own indiscretions with the Vietnam Papers, which was something he just couldn't seem to get away from, and with good reason. That would also be a good video. Vietnam was where the face of warfare changed. Let me literally change. And I shouldn't say Vietnam. Where it really changed was in Algeria with the French. The United States wasn't involved in that one, but yeah, that would be a good video. How you can win every single battle of the war and still lose the war. Anyway, for another video. Maybe, maybe not. So now you have the Great Society, you have the Civil Rights Movement, a couple of filibusters, nothing important. Vietnam Papers come out. Nixon gets into a whole lot of trouble and is actually held accountable until President Gerald Ford pardons him. It's not the first time the government made that mistake. Now, going back to the Civil War in the 1860s, we let everybody off. More accurately, Lincoln let everybody off. I don't think she should have done that. I think that was the actual precipitus for what we're going through now. And to be fair, this is a new idea for me. This was not something I believed 2 years ago. We'll get back to that because that's going to come up again later in this video. In the 1780s, President Washington, at this time he was president, he begged Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, he begged them, don't do things the way you're doing them. The way you guys are doing these things, we're going to end up with strictly two parties. And we're going to have a condition at some point in the future where we can't build coalitions across the two parties. And we're not going to be able to govern. Now, the reality is, it's always been that way. But at some point, somebody decided to sit down and do what Speaker Pelosi was so horribly good at. She was better than Joe Cannon. Prior to Pelosi, Joe Cannon held the record for how do we get to yes. Joe Cannon was also Speaker of the House under President Lincoln. Without diminishing Lincoln's accomplishments, you got to give props to Speaker Cannon. You got to give props to Secretary of State Seward. They were both instrumental. And there was one other congressman whom I can't remember. Or maybe he was a senator. But he was an abolitionist. And because he was martyred, he was instrumental. Continuing on. Now we're at the point where we almost, but not quite, held President Nixon accountable for his actions. Didn't quite do it. Didn't reach it. Now, under President Nixon, two things happened. Nixon made a campaign promise that he had to keep. And he had to keep it because of the Vietnam Papers. He promised that he would end the war. I don't believe, from the core of my existence, I have no belief that Nixon intended to end Vietnam. Nixon actually talked to the Vietnamese government. He talked to Ho Chi Minh's people and told them not to make a deal with President Johnson. Because if he was elected, he'd give them better terms. So Ho Chi Minh's government did not make a peace agreement with President Johnson. In spite of the efforts, and at one point in time, I can't say if memory serves because I'm not that old. But if I remember my history correctly, Johnson got very close to having a peace agreement with Ho Chi Minh. And Nixon destroyed that peace agreement. That came out with the Vietnam Papers. So with the publication by the Washington Post and the New York Times, because originally the Vietnam Papers were published by the New York Times. They both used the same source from Northrop Grumman. The Washington Post got greater notoriety, but the New York Times published it first. So the Vietnam Papers get published. Nixon gets caught. He has to end the war. He ends the war in Vietnam. He brings back roughly a million American servicemen. And there are no jobs. Generally what happens is at the end of a war, you have a reconversion. But withdrawal doesn't usually happen overnight. So you have time to absorb that reconversion. You develop policy to bring these military people back in. And make no mistake about it, particularly the U.S. military. The U.S. military is one of the best vocational schools in the world. Their documentation is extraordinary. So if you're a clerk in the military, a filing clerk in the military, you're capable of doing QA like nobody's business. You're trained for it. You're extremely good at it. Their logistics are the best in the world. The military, the U.S. military in particular, knows how to move product. You have all of these really highly skilled individuals that come out of the military. You do your reconversion right, all of them can have jobs in civilian life right after military service. But Nixon's an idiot, and the American electorate is wholly uninterested. Add on to that, for the first time, the American electorate actually got to see what war looks like. War has always been brutal. It has always been ugly. It's always been messy. It's always looked reprehensible, because it is. It's extremely difficult, regardless of how justifiable. We had to go to World War II. It was the right thing to do. We had to stop the Nazis. You had to stop Kaiser Wilhelm. It was the right thing to do. Those wars were necessary. Those wars had to be fought. Vietnam didn't have to be fought, but we chose to fight it. Korea didn't have to be fought, but we chose to fight it. And with Vietnam in particular, we got to watch on the evening news. We got to see it. We got to see the jungle after it got hit with Agent Orange. We saw it before Agent Orange, and then we got to see it the next morning after Agent Orange just cleared all of it. We got to see what we were doing in Cambodia, because the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, they were going through Cambodia and Laos and coming in, forcing the United States to fight a two-front war. And the decision was made at the top by Robert McNamara, who used to be the head of the Department of Defense under President Kennedy. Now he's just a consultant under Nixon. McNamara made the decision to go in and firebomb Laos and Cambodia to cut the North Vietnamese army and Viet Cong off, so they couldn't come in to the south of us and put us in a two-front war. All of the American people saw that on television. We got to see it happen. We got to see what these people looked like after they were firebombed. We got to see the South Vietnamese army punish the prisoners of war from the North Vietnamese army. We got to see all of that brutality up close and personal right in our living rooms. So we hated the Vietnam veterans coming back because we found their behavior inexcusable. The problem is that this is the nature of war. And those young men, they were doing what they were supposed to do. So you've got an economy that's on the verge of faltering for other reasons. Among those reasons is the U.S. currency, which originally was tied to the gold standard, was decoupled from gold, and it was coupled to gross domestic product. That's actually a pretty smart way to do it. We should have done it after the Second World War. It would have given us a stronger currency, and it would have made the currency more robust for economic downturns. The reason that I say that is the world wars didn't occur on U.S. soil, right? So our industry was intact at the end of both World War I and World War II. That's what allowed us to become an economic power. Europe had to rebuild all of its industry. Russia, and then later on the Soviet Union, had the same problem Europe had. They had to rebuild all of their industry. Same with Northern Africa. So you had the industrial states like Libya and Tunisia and Morocco. Their industry had to be rebuilt. The war occurred there. The war didn't occur here. We didn't have to rebuild our industry. So I think the smarter thing would have been for President Wilson to decouple the gold standard and couple it to GDP and then invest in industry. You'd have to regulate industry. The evidence for that is Cornelius Vanderbilt. He's a perfect argument for regulation. Story for another time, maybe another video. Moving forward. Nixon decides to blame the economy on OPEC. OPEC says, well, we're going to do the time. We're doing the time. Since we're doing the time, let's do the crime. So OPEC shut off oil production. And they literally brought the U.S. economy to its knees. And then bad economic decision, bad economic policy decision, after bad economic policy decision, after bad economic policy decision, coupled with the fact that the GDP is what's backing the U.S. dollar. Industry as a whole decides, well, since the gold standard no longer exists, we're going to go into austerity. So they stop investment. So when industry stops investment, the gold standard gone, the economy truly tanked. Unemployment begins to steadily rise. All through President Ford's term, unemployment's bad. President Carter puts the nation in austerity. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. He begins to deregulate. Again, not necessarily because he wanted to, but because he had to. Turns out that deregulation was actually pretty smart. It allows industry to begin getting a foothold. And it also is an impetus for investment. What President Carter doesn't do is a New Deal style social policy. So he doesn't actually invest in poor people. What he tries to do is just stabilize industry. Because industry is trying to tank the economy as a whole. Industry itself made the decision, we're going to go into austerity. And he's trying to convince industry that, no, hey, look, you go into austerity, everybody in the country starves. So he starts the deregulation platform. He does things to make it attractive for industry to invest. And eventually they begin investing. And then by 1978, we're in double-digit inflation. It's completely out of control. And the reality is this inflation is a direct result of Nixon's economic policies. Because what Nixon was doing was quite literally robbing the future to finance the present. without having a plan to put that money back. And Gerald Ford did the same thing. You want a good analogy? It's what Ronald Reagan did to Social Security. By making up this awfully, just intuitively false statement that Social Security will always be there. So we can borrow the money from Social Security to pay for some defense policy that will never work. Star Wars. Or Golden Dome. Yeah, it's never going to work. And buy a physics textbook. It'll teach you why it doesn't work. The physics is just not there. In any case. You have this mess. So now, the liberal Democrats that have basically been in control from Kennedy through Johnson, and then again for President Carter. Nixon and Ford hurt the economy so badly that the tools didn't exist to fix it. And then, of course, you had the hostage crisis. So we have this backlash against the Democrats. 1972, you had the terrorist attack on the Israeli wrestling team. Then in 1972, you also have the OPEC production stop. So you have this entire backlash against the Democratic Party, and the Republicans gain control. And the Republicans tell lie on lie on lie. Nobody says anything. The irony is that everybody knew, whether you supported them or you didn't support them. Everybody admitted, oh yeah, we know they're lying. We know that they haven't made a factual statement yet. Note, I used the term factual. I didn't use the term true. Because if you agreed with them, it's quite possible that you believed what they were saying was true. At the same time, you knew what they were saying wasn't factual. Then comes along Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich, who was of the opinion that conservatives weren't nasty enough. They had to be nastier. Newt Gingrich would make a proposal, and if any Democrat backed that proposal, he'd tank it. And for those of you who say, hey, that sounds like Mitch McConnell, it is. Yeah, Mitch McConnell did the same thing. I remember when I was 10 years old, and I was arguing with all the kids in middle school and elementary school that, hey, Reagan's a bad guy. And what the Republicans are doing is ethically wrong. And if you keep walking down this road, you're going to create a fascist government. Now, to be fair, I understood maybe about 10% of what I was saying. A lot of it came from my dad in particular. And as I get older, and as I understand more the logic behind what he was saying, not only do I agree, I don't think he went far enough. Not only am I convinced he was right, I think he stopped short. So now you have the combination of Reagan's policies, which Reagan's policy was just keep spending. It's the government. The money's going to be there forever. And the only thing that we need to spend money on is defense. And Newt Gingrich's policy of just hurt the Democrats. That's all you have to do. And that kept happening. And then you had the neocons with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was a horrible person. He was a horrible president. And he wasn't a Democrat. Bill Clinton was a Republican through and through. Bill Clinton repealed one law. And with repealing that law, he guaranteed that the American economy will suck forever. Glass-Steagall. One of the big reasons for the Great Depression was that speculative investors were borrowing money to invest. When those investments didn't pan out, they defaulted on those loans. And after enough defaults, the money in the bank was gone. So when one of your neighbors went to draw his money out of the bank, and the bank said, I can't give you the money you want because I don't have it, he did what any one of us would do. He went home and told his neighbors that, hey, go to your bank and get your money because you might not be able to later. So you had to run on the banks. So under President Roosevelt, we passed Glass-Steagall, which said that if an investment bank was going to loan the money to make the investments from a speculative investor, that speculative investor had to show they had collateral equal to the value of the loan, so that the bank could absorb the collateral and sell it for the value of the loan. That was Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall did one other thing. It separated the savings and loans and the investment banks. So the investment bank couldn't take money out of its savings and loan. It had to prove that if it took money out of its savings and loan for investment, it could put that money back. That's what Glass-Steagall did. President Clinton repealed Glass-Steagall. So now, when we get an economic bubble, and that bubble bursts, it hurts a lot more, by multiple orders of magnitude more. And make no mistake about it, Bill Clinton was not a Democrat. Bill Clinton was a Republican. I don't care what he says. His policies were conservative. He acted like a conservative. He talked like a conservative. He looked like a conservative. He walked like a conservative. Looks like a duck. Walks like a duck. Quacks like a duck. It's a duck. Clinton was a conservative. And now here we are. Newt Gingrich, don't allow Democrat anything. No negotiation, no getting to yes, no passing legislation. So now, we're up to Newt Gingrich and the wholly despicable, disgusting person that he actually is. You realize that somebody like Newt Gingrich didn't go into government because he wants to govern. He went into government for the strict purpose of making people he doesn't like suffer. That's why Newt Gingrich went into government. But he can justify it by saying, oh, well, private industry does everything better. All right, so let's analyze that statement. Even with Jim Crow in place, we didn't have an incarceration problem. We didn't have an unbelievable number of incarcerated people. We were about average with the rest of the world, even with Jim Crow. Right? So even with Jim Crow, we don't have an unreasonable number of incarcerated people. We privatized the prisons, and literally overnight, we had the most incarcerated people in the world. The moment we privatized prisons, it was less than 2 weeks. The U.S. led the world in the number of incarcerated people. Under President Reagan, we privatized insurance. Insurance companies for property and casualty. It takes an act of Mitch McConnell to get your P&C insurance claim approved. They call it benefit management, but in reality, they're not managing benefits, they're denying benefits. Now, the reason for that is that they take your insurance premiums and use your premiums for speculative investment. And they actually make money by borrowing against their speculative investments, which means that if they have to pay out your claim, they can't pay back the loan that they took out to invest in the latest market bubble, which will pop. And when it pops, well, they're going to lose money. Because market bubbles only work if there's uncontrolled fraud involved. Now, you, the American electorate, have decided that you don't want to read about economic bubbles. And to be honest, maybe you don't have to. But hey, take a look at a Michael Lewis interview once in a while. Maybe watch a Michael Lewis lecture. He does a lot of them. And they're really pretty good. And you don't have to be an economist to understand them. He's really effective at communicating. And it's not just Michael Lewis, Robert Reich. Or let's just look at basic evidence. Show me one time trickle-down economics has actually worked. Just one. I just want a conservative out there to give me one example of successful trickle-down economics. Just one. The reason we became so polarized. To be fair, it has always been this way. Even prior to Nixon, it was like this. Newt Gingrich made it okay. Because the economy got so bad under President Carter, the American electorate just forgot everything they ever learned. It's like listening to somebody say Trump signed my stimulus check, so he gave me money. Nancy Pelosi worked her ass off to get that stimulus through Congress. Trump threatened to veto it twice. You didn't get shit from Trump. You got it from Nancy Pelosi. But hey, you know, what do I know? I'm a flunky, man. I don't know anything. I will tell you this. Newt Gingrich demanding and insisting that Republicans be mean for the sake of being mean. The American electorate deciding that Ronald Reagan is spending all of my grandchildren and children's money. But hey, I'm getting rich off of it, so it's okay. And never once deciding to ask, where are these pay-fors coming from? And then Mitch McConnell, who decided that the Senate wasn't going to do jack shit for the whole time that he's leader of the Senate. And they didn't. They didn't do anything when Mitch McConnell was Senate leader. Now, in modern times, all of these people are Republican. Make no mistake about it. Prior to FDR, the Democrats were doing this. Prior to FDR, the Democrats were the conservatives. After FDR, the Republicans were the conservatives. So from the very beginning, conservatives never wanted to govern. You want to know why we're so polarized? Because conservatives don't want to govern. Let me say that again. We're as polarized as we are because conservatives don't want to govern. What does that mean? Well, government is problem resolution through a solution that nobody likes and only kind of works. That's an extremely good, practical working definition of government. Now, who do I blame for this? The American electorate. Man, you bought that brainwashing from President Reagan, hook, line, and sinker. Boy, he really raped you and you loved it. Too late to do anything about that. How do we move forward?